delighted to be sharing and celebrating the Juneteenth holiday with you today. The name of this holiday comes from combining the words June and 19th in honor of Emancipation Day. Juneteenth was originally celebrated in Texas on June 19, 1866. It marked the first anniversary of the day that African Americans there first learned of the Emancipation Proclamation. That was more than 2 years after it was initially issued. The holiday was originally celebrated with prayer meetings and by singing spirituals and wearing new clothes to represent the newfound freedom. Within a few years, African Americans were celebrating Juneteenth in other states, making it an annual tradition. We are honored to be partnering with the Berlin Equity Action Team for the second year in a row to mark this holiday. The purpose of BEAT is to create teachable moments with residents of Berlin and connect with neighbors. Thank you so much, BEAT, for the work that you do in our community. And I want to say a special thank you to Chris Barlow, Antoinette Price, Kristen Zarabozo, Kevin Wilhelm, Aurora Courtville, and to the Berlin Historical Society. I saw Lorraine and Heidi here. Thank you all so much for sharing your time and expertise so that we can offer this to the Berlin community today. You may or may not know that Berlin played a role in the emancipation of slaves by offering refuge along the Underground Railroad, and we'll learn more about that today. Berlin was also home to Civil War heroes of the 29th and 31st Regiments that were instrumental in winning the Civil War. And if you have not had a moment to check out the art display we have in the entryway, we have some silhouettes done by Kristen Zarabozo, and they depict the work that those soldiers did in our honor. So today we're offering a variety of talks and activities to help you all learn more about Juneteenth. So our event will be going on until 3 o'clock today. We'll have plenty of food. Come for the content, I said, and stay for the food, because the food last year was fantastic. We're going to be doing a wide awake lantern craft all day for kids and adults. And we'll have our keynote speaker, Jeffrey Fletcher, up first. You ready? Is he here? Okay, perfect. So Jeffrey Fletcher is the executive director of the Ruby and Calvin Fletcher African American History Museum, which houses a collection of artifacts reflecting decades of turbulent times for African Americans. Jeffrey is one of 4 children whose parents migrated from the South during the Jim Crow era and the turbulent civil rights movement. After college, he began collecting African American artifacts and memorabilia. Jeffrey spent 14 years employed within the state of Connecticut Department of Mental Health and 21 years as a police officer in the city of New Haven, where the community he served was a multicultural community comprised of African American and Latino neighborhoods. Jeffrey, welcome.
And again.
I am Jeffrey Fletcher. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Chris, for having me here. This has been a journey. This museum has been a journey for me. It has been in historical proportions. It was one of these things that just born after my mom and my dad passed away. So when I speak, I'm going to be speaking about, you're going to hear me reference my mom, Ruby, a lot, only because my mom was the motivating factor behind this collection. Now, what I need to say is that I've enhanced her collection from 250 pieces since her passing 13 years ago, right? And I've enhanced it to up to 8,500 pieces, right? So what we have done was we have made the first African American History Museum in Stratford, Connecticut, located at 952 East Broadway. We've been there 2 years, since October 30th of 2021. At that time, we all know we were in the midst of COVID. And at this point, being that this was such a very controversial years over the past several years, and then this museum comes up, I was afraid that it might have been a COVID spreader because we had about 500 to 600 people on this property for our grand opening. But thank God it was not that. So, the museum was motivated, inspired by my mom, who grew up in the South during the 1930s, right, in Camden, South Carolina. So the cards that you see on your laps that were passed out, there are 2 significant symbolic signs on that card, which is a tree in a shack, right? That shack is reminiscent of my mom, where she lived with my grandparents and her 7 brothers and sisters in Camden, South Carolina. That was a sharecropper's farm, right? And the only way that they were able to live in that dwelling was they had to work the fields. And the tree is symbolic because the nutmeg, the tree, the elm tree of the state of Connecticut, that's where she was born, in that home, and where she transitioned up here to the Connecticut, that tree where she is now buried in Colchester, Connecticut, alongside my dad, right? So my mom comes from South Carolina, my dad from a place called Fuquay, Farina, North Carolina, which is outside of, you must know where that is, just outside of Raleigh. And they didn't meet until they came to Colchester. Now, if we talk about the Great Migration from the South in the 30s, my mom left Camden, South Carolina in the 1930s at the age of 16. And the reason why she left was for better housing, better employment, education, as well as escaping Jim Crow and the Klan, okay? So when she came north, she had nowhere to live. And when she landed in Colchester, there were people that took her in. But the people who took her in Colchester were Orthodox Jewish people, right? And some of them were survivors of the Holocaust camp. They took her in, not as a servant, not as a domestic. They educated her, they gave her her culture as well as their culture. There were 2 things that my mom always said, was never forget who you are, where you come from, but also, importantly, living in the Jewish household, never forget. Never forget what had happened in Germany. Never forget how Jewish folks were systematically genocide. So I tell people this, that I have the best of both worlds growing up in Colchester. I grew up in a Southern Baptist Christian home as well as a Jewish home. I tell people that I spent more time in temple than I did in church. And so I had the best of both worlds. I welcome Juneteenth very much in the town of Stratford. We had a big presentation yesterday, and it was, if you know the lay of the land in Stratford, the lay of the land in Stratford was 35 years ago, was the parade ground for the Grand Imperial Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, right? It no longer is to this day. So when I set foot in Stratford to put this museum up, the mayor, the administration, they all embraced this. And the reason why they embraced it, because they felt this history was and is very important. Now I want to tell people this. Chris, when you get, if I'm speaking too long, give me the old heave-ho or the cane in the neck, I'll get off. Because I tend to linger a little bit. So when I sat down with the mayor, I said to the mayor, I'm not trying to take anything from the community. I want to enhance this community. I want to bring economic stability here, because we were just coming off the COVID, and jobs and small business, moms and pop business were going out. And so when I sat down with her, I said to her, I said, listen, what we need to do, because everybody's so fearful about this history, Juneteenth, everybody's fearful about Black history, everybody's fearful about the curriculum. And I say to people when they come to the museum, the first thing I have my staff do is we go through a little ritual with the people, the traffickers, or the people that come through. One of the things that I point out is that you don't need to be afraid of this history. And if you are, for instance, if you're afraid of this history, and you say to me, you know, I'm internalizing this and I feel a certain way about it, I feel guilty because it shows and tells what white folks have done to Black people over the decades and the centuries and so forth and so on. And if you tell me all of that stuff is making you feel a certain way and you feel guilty about it, I'm going to say, what is your name?
Gloria.
Gloria. I'm going to say, Gloria, you and I need to go stand in the corner and we need to talk, because I think you and I can make a lot of money. And how I mean we can make a lot of money is this. If you were any part of this, right? Any part of that, I'm going to say we can make a lot of money. And if you say to me what I just said, you feel really sensitive about it, you feel internalized about it, that means you are suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? We know what post-traumatic stress disorder is. Post-traumatic stress disorder is that you have dealt with this stuff up close, up personal, and you know how it makes people feel, right? And I'm going to say, Gloria, you know what? I'm not going to buy that. What I'm saying to you is this, is that you didn't live any part of that. No one in this room lived any parts of that, right? So there's no need to feel that way. It's history, right? It's our history. It's history that happened. So for anybody to tell me, because I have black folks that tell me, I don't want to see that stuff. I know that stuff. I've seen it. Well, guess what? You didn't live it either. Right? So there's a balance here now. We got to remember there's a balance. And what we do in our museum, we talk truth to power, we're transparent, and we're honest. Now I want to back up a little bit. I am not a historian, I'm not a professor, I'm not an expert, I am not even a curator. None of that. That's none of my degrees, none of my background. My bachelor's and master's are in psychology. And my career was law enforcement. So all of what you see behind me does not make me an expert because I look like what this is. If I don't know the answer to it, I ain't gonna guess at it, I'm gonna go find the answer. And so, having said all of that, Juneteenth in our museum, what we do is we talk about these objects. And one thing we do, because these were objects that were worn, and I'm a curator's worst nightmare. Do we have a curator in this library? Is there a curator, somebody that handles?
No.
Okay.
Just a librarian.
All right, so I'm just a cop with stuff. So we're both on equal footing here. So when you come to my museum, you're not going to be looking inside, outside and the inside. What I believe has to happen is that in order to feel the brevity of what was worn, and I let people handle this, right? Because if it was meant to be broke, it would have been broke 200, 300 years. This thing is about 250 years old, right? If it was meant to be broken, it would have been broke, right? And that's why we're here today for Juneteenth, because we want to show that that was history. That was history, but people had to suffer in order to get to where we are. I'm standing on some big shoulders as we speak, because think about this, 175 years, 200 years ago, I wouldn't be doing this. I can tell you that right now. But these objects, we allow our people that come to the museum to touch them because we want you to feel the history. We want you to feel the weight of it. So it's not the Peabody Museum, and it's not the British Art Museum, and it's doggone is not the Smithsonian. So these objects here, if I'm up here, I do have a sign that says, please do not touch artifact. If I'm up here and you're looking around and you want to come up, and I'll be up here after however long I have, I will let you hold these things so you can get a sense. Now this object was, can anybody tell me what this was used for? Around the neck, right?
Prevent people from running away by making noise.
That's right. So, I'm not putting it on, but if you run, right? And for those people that think, when they watch these movies, Mandingo, Roots, any of those other shows, and you see the bloodhounds running through the swamps, and you hear them woof, woof, woofing, and they're out there for hours, that ain't true, don't believe it. Take it from a law enforcement person who has been on tracking teams and running through the woods for about 20, 25 minutes. Those dogs' nose only last for 10, 15 minutes. Then they get burnt out. So when you see them running through the woods, and they're bloodhounds and stuff, state police bloodhounds, because I've been with the state police as well, doing tracking, and that doesn't work. This is how bounty hunters caught runaway slaves, right? It wasn't about sniffing through woods or anything. When we talk about, and when you come to the museum, we have recreated a slave ship, a hull of a slave ship. So when you walk into that space in the museum of the slave ship, right, you will see nothing, because the dark, cavernous old. And the only thing you will rely upon is your hearing. You're not going to see anything in front of you, because when Africans were taken from the continent and placed in the hulls of those ships, it was pitch dark. This is where they stayed if they were shackled in for 2 to 6 months, wherever the voyage was going to take them across the world, right? And it was called, some people call it the Middle Passages, some people call it the transatlantic voyage, right? Coming from the continent of Africa, going to all parts of the world. And plantations weren't only used as workforces, they were used as breeding farms too. Because if you come to the museum, you will see photographs of a whole, what they call a gang of African slaves or slaves that are females, and they were specifically put there for breeding. Ask, oh yeah, the other thing. ask questions too along the way, even though we know there's a Q&A, ask questions, because I believe if it's fresh in your mind, I want you to know it. And there is no dumb answer and no stupid question, okay? By the way, I know one of the questions is going to come up with this. How did you get this, right? How do I find these? Well, auctions, people donate them, but mainly they're buried in the ground, right? So during, as we talk about Reconstruction, but as we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, a lot of these plantations and farms were places where Africans or slaves were working to the bone. And so when the North came in to take over a lot of these plantations that were either burned to the ground by Yankee troops, they had to find federal monies to rebuild those plantations to make them prosperous. So when the government was putting out money in the South to rebuild the South during Reconstruction, you had to be in compliance with showing that you're trying to rebuild the South. And what was happening was a lot of these plantation owners were doing what? They were digging holes. They were digging holes and dropping these things in, because we didn't have smelting units like you would find in industrial Pittsburgh, where you could just throw something in the fire and it'll melt down. You had to forge stuff back then. So they were digging holes and throwing these things in the ground. People like myself, 200-300 years later, if I'm ambitious enough and I want to endure the heat of Alabama and Mississippi, I'm going to go down there with a high-tech metal detector, and I'm going to walk some of these plantations, but I'm going to set a grid out, right? I'm going to set a grid. If I'm going to do it in this room, I'm going to set a grid pattern out, and I'll spend all day going up and down until I hear something. And the reason, as I said, they bury these objects. Two important things that history, when people tell you that history repeats itself, believe it. Believe it. And I say history repeats itself as we talk today. History is trying to repeat itself. And I say this, look at two incidents that have happened in this world. We look at ISIS, we look at Taliban, we look at places like Fallujah. What did they do over there? They went through these villages, these towns, they started breaking up scrolls, they started breaking up anything that has to do with culture, religion, education, destroying it, decimating it. Why? Because they did not want that history to be told or anybody to talk about it. And that goes for the same with this stuff. We can even go back a little further, right? Let's go back to 1938, 1939, in a place called Germany, Berlin, right? What was Hitler and his Nazi political regime doing? They were doing the same thing as these individuals were doing in trying to bury history, hide facts. And they were burning books, they were arresting educators, they were arresting political leaders, they were arresting anyone Jewish that had any intellectual capabilities of doing anything. And so what they did was they had a big bonfire. They were burning books, right? Trying to change history. And that was called Kristallnacht, right? History repeats itself, right? History repeats itself. I have to include all of this in here because this is important. This stuff here is really, really important. These objects were used to oppress behaviors, change attitudes, restrict people from movement, speaking. And there were very, very difficult, very hard things for people to imagine that were attributed to putting around somebody to stifle or suppress their emotions. How am I doing for time?
You're doing well. You're doing great.
All right. I use these objects because you know what? As a public safety, as a law enforcement officer, we use these objects. And if we're talking about Juneteenth, and if we're talking about freedom, if we're talking about legal stuff, law stuff, I use these. Not these, but I had some modern ones that were nice and shiny, and they were technologically fit. They were hinges, right? Right? I tell young folks today, and I love it when I'm talking before young folks, colleges, high schools, because I use these as a reference point. This hasn't changed except for the fact that now it's kind of like used universal, but it's still used to keep people from moving about and taking their freedoms away. These took freedoms away. The handcuffs that I used took freedoms away. But still, look what we have. And look what we had then that I wore on my back here that I used to take somebody's freedom and liberty away. We look at these objects here again. Can anybody tell me what this may be?
Puts the hands together, goes around the neck and puts
That's
the
right.
hands together.
Do you think this was a child? Do you think this was an adult?
My God,
Woman.
An adult, maybe a woman.
they didn't care.
So when we talk about, and we have to talk about the tough stuff, right? This is tough stuff. And when you come to my museum, I'm going to be flip-flopping back and forth. When you come to my museum, that's what you're going to see, tough stuff. It gets better. This isn't all what African American history or African history is about. But we got to talk about the tough stuff. There have been people coming through the museum that have actually said, you know what? Why do we have to see this? Why do we have to know this? Well, there was a beginning. Definitely a beginning. And again, I tried to explain to them the Beyoncés, the Magic Johnsons, the Michael Jordans, those individuals should be humble. They should be talking about the sacrifices that were made, all right? There were people that bled, sweat, cried, and died in these things. And when we talk about the size of these individuals, see, I'm trying to get everything in, so I'm flip-flopping all over the world here, right? So bear with me. So when we talk about the size of these, right, Africans were small-statured people. My mom was from South Carolina. She wasn't a small-statured people, but she was a Gullah, right? And we all know what Gullahs are, right? They have a dialect of English, a little bit of English, a little bit of patois, a little bit of everything. So she understood it, but she couldn't speak it. And so when relatives got around, all you hear kind of like sound like patois when you hear somebody West Indian speak. It's not similar to that, but it's all broken language, broken English. But they understood. And the same people that were in the hulls of those ships, everybody thought or think that they all understood each other. The continent of Africa is huge. You could put 2.5, maybe 3 Americas in there. And so imagine you having 175 to 300 Africans in the hull of a ship. They're not understanding and communicating with each other, right? And all they know is pain, misery, and heartache. But they were small statured. So if we see in our history books, I grew up on history books. I'm dating myself, right? I grew up watching Walter Cronkite, Eric Sevareid, those people, right? So I'm dating myself. That was our history book. But when I went to school, in our history books, when we didn't even know anything about Juneteenth. All we knew about was slavery, Civil War, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, right? That's all we knew. But when it came time, because I grew up in Colchester now, y'all, right? I grew up in Colchester. Colchester is no different than Berlin, right? So every time I went to history class, I would sit in the history class, or the social studies class, and they give us these big books. We didn't have computers. We have to flip to the side section that said Civil War. And every time I went into the section of Civil War, we studied that for about 2-3 weeks, I would always get a stomach ache, miraculous stomach ache, go to the nurse's office. And the reason why I would go to the nurse's office, because it was just too painful for me to see, because I was worried about what my white friends would say. Would they say, Jeff, or snicker in the back, Jeff, you look like that, because they depicted these Africans as pickaninnies, as wild aborigines, cannibals, and I'd sit there like this until one day the nurse called my mother's house, my mom and dad's house, and said, Jeffrey's been in the nurse's office at least twice a week for about 3 weeks. My mother wanted to know what that was about when I got home, because I was out in the yard playing, jumping, and doing everything else. And so she further came to school because she figured out a pattern. On Tuesdays, I would end up in the nurse's office. So she came. They called her. She came. And she asked me, what are you doing? And so I stood there and looked at her, and she said, what are you doing? Why are you here? You left home, you didn't have a stomachache. And it came out years later. I mean, I couldn't articulate because I didn't know the words to use. It came out later that I was embarrassed on the teaching. the curriculum, how it was being taught. And that was one of the motivating factors for me to be here, to do what I'm doing, and inspiration for the museum. But when we went to the social studies book, and getting back to that shackle with the smallness of it, when we look into the hull of the slave ship, and these Africans were piled in these ships like sardines, like the Cotilia, which is in now grounded, and they're trying to resurrect that and down the coast of South Carolina. When you look at the Africans that were piled in there, they weren't my size. They were probably this big, 3 to 4.5 feet big, because they had to pack these individuals in. We talk about Africans when they arrive here in 1619, right, on the shores of Virginia. But we never talk about how they got here, the conditions of how they got here, and the ones that didn't make it, right? And so when we talk about these Africans that were piled in these ships, they were thought of as cargo, not human beings. Cargo. Cargo. They were considered cargo, but yet these ship captains, and when you come to the museum again, I keep referencing the museum, when you come to the museum, you will see the hull of the slave ship inside, but these captains did not have the wherewithal to figure out how to balance and to buoyancy these ships out, because they would be killing 2 birds with 1 stone by getting cargo, supplies, every port that they came to, and piling it all in these ships, and made it unbalanced. And so as we see the seas swelter, those ships went over real quick. If you've been on a cruise and you've been in the middle of the ocean for a day, and all of a sudden they tell you we're going to be out to sea for a day, and the ship starts to list a little bit, stabilizers kick in, right? And all of a sudden you don't get seasick anymore, right? But again, imagine being in one of these ships and there is no stabilization system, and a big swell comes over it and it takes that boat over. We're going to get to something very interesting now. Everyone thinks, how were those ships insured? Somebody tell me, how were they insured? Who insured those slave ships from England? Who?
Insurance.
Insurance companies. But where were those insurance companies located? New England, London, Hartford,
The Netherlands.
Hartford, Hartford,
Hartford.
Travelers, insurance companies, right? So when those ships went down, these ship captains would get to port as quick as they can so that they could file their reports. It always ended up, there were no survivors. They didn't try to have any survivors, right? Until these insurance companies said, you know, we're not going to pay these losses anymore. And so these ship captains started to become more accountable of how they package their cargo, including slaves. And I say all of this because no one's hands are clean, right? No one's hands are clean. But it doesn't make it doesn't make it right to sit here and persecute and point the finger at anyone in this space. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And that's why when people come into the museum, and you know, some folks have a chip on their shoulder, black folks have a chip on their shoulder, because remember I told you I speak truth to power, and I'm transparent? So when they come in and they have a chip on their shoulder and they see this stuff and they say, damn white people, look what they did. Look what they did to our people. I go back to Africa. Even though we know slavery went as far back as the pyramids in the biblical days, right? Every culture, every race, every religion of people had slaves, right? That's a truism. But Africans sold Africans, right? And to this day, we have what we call, I always say it because sometimes stuff is perpetuated. We talk about bias, we talk about stereotypes, we talk about discrimination. We have notice I said intra-discriminatory values that we place on each other, right? We don't need you to make any bias or stereotypes against us. We do it to ourselves. And we address these issues in the museum. So when you come to the museum, it is not one-sided. We tell the truth, we talk the truth, but in order to understand this history, we have to have open minds, we have to be truthful, and we have to be honest. Because if you're going to come to my museum and you're going to tell me, you know, yo brother, I'm this, I'm that, and I'm going to ask you some questions. And if you don't, because I pretty much know the answers to a lot of the questions I'm going to ask you. And if it doesn't sound right, or whether it's black or white, I'm going to say sorry, I can't deal with you right now because you have a lot of bias. So my mom, she didn't collect this stuff. I collected this. Some of the things that I did bring, a few of the objects of her 250 pieces, because she collected ephemera. She collected ephemera. For y'all that don't know what ephemera is, ephemera are paper goods, signage, books, and different things like that, that are newspapers and things. That's what she collected. And she continued to collect into her young adult years, as well as her years as a parent and as a wife. She continued to collect. Those objects are more familiar with who she was and what she dealt with. She dealt with a lot of Jim Crow signage, where African Americans had to drink out of certain water fountains and so forth. Quick story. There was a department store here in Connecticut called G. Fox, right?
Yes.
I think it was in Hartford.
Yeah.
This story is a real good story because I often, when I do these presentations, a lot of it comes with a lot of oral history, especially for my 114-year-old great-grandmother who was the daughter of a slave, and she passed away when I was in college in 1983. So she was born in 1873, probably a decade after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and to hear her talk, I pulled in a lot of information. We have oral tapes of her as well. But to hear my mom talk about G. Fox, so she was living with this Jewish family, and they went shopping in Hartford. And this was in the 1950s. There used to be a lunch counter in G. Fox, if I understand what she told me. And they sat down after shopping, and the woman, who was white, was the waitress. She said, "Sorry, I'm not going to be able to serve her." And my mother's friend said, the woman who was caring for my mother, she said, "Why not?" And she said, "Because she's colored," and walked away. Now, here's the irony of, they didn't have cell phones back then. And if you know the Jewish people, because in my hometown, whenever the rabbi come to town from New York and he had the big refrigeration truck with all the kosher chicken and all the gefilte fish and all of the good cuisine, Jewish cuisine, the temple, the Hadassah, would call my mom and say, "Ruby, you got to come up to temple. The rabbi's here." And she'd go up and she'd get what she has to get because we ate in a kosher home too. So she'd go up. That's how close she was. But when this happened, they got home. The woman said nothing. She went to the phone, dialed the phone, because back then it was dial. And she called someone, a friend of hers, who lived in West Hartford. It so happened to be the owners of G. Fox. Before that phone was, their conversation was done, however way she was able to converse with the woman, and the woman was able to converse with her husband, that woman was gone before the end of the day. So when we talk about this kind of behavior, when we talk about that was then, because a lot of black children will say, that was then, this is now. Things aren't going to be like that. But my mom lived that section. My mom lived that society. She lived that Jim Crow stuff, and it came up here, followed her here. I'm going to give you another quick story. As a law enforcement officer, well, before I get to that. So some of these objects, everybody think was manufactured, reproduced in the South, below the Mason-Dixon. Nah. If you go, you can Google, we have smartphones, everybody got smartphones. When you get an opportunity, look up J.E. Stevens Company. J.E. Stevens Company was a toy metal manufacturing company in Cromwell, Connecticut. In Cromwell, Connecticut, the J.E. Stevens Company manufactured, reproduced this bank. It's called the Jolly, I'm not going to say the word, but it's on there. And my mom collected about 9 of them. It was called the Jolly N-Word Bank. Cromwell, Connecticut. Went out of business in 1958. J.E. Stevens and Company, right? And they had these grotesque, hideous little banks that if you put your hand out, like the bank puts his hand out, you put a dime or a quarter on it, and you have a lever on the back, and it goes up, the eyes roll, and the coin goes in. Then you had another one, the tongue sticks out, you put it on, you pull his, twist his ear, it goes in. Hideous, hideous, humiliating objects. So when we talk about Jim Crow, we talk about discrimination, we talk about suppression, we got to look at all over the country. And perhaps, this is only my opinion, perhaps why there is so much angst and so much pushback for this history is because it happened here on this land, this soil, this United States. If Ken Burns, does anybody know who Ken Burns was? Okay, Ken Burns is a well-known documentarist person who called on me to sit on a panel. He wrote this documentary called The Holocaust and Jim Crow. So it was on PBS. I was asked to sit on the panel. We had a scholar from, I'm not a scholar, y'all. I was asked to sit on the panel with this Yale scholar from the Gelman Center, Slave Center, also the National Holocaust Museum, and of course our museum, to talk about what we can draw parallels from in another hemisphere to the United States during that period of time. Even though we know slavery had gone back into the 1500s, we brought it forward and we had to make the parallel of what was the difference of going on in 1930s, 1940s, even 1950s in Germany and what was going on here with lynchings and so forth and so on. So I brought up the argument, and somebody got a little teed off because I said, lynchings, nobody patented that name, nobody patented Holocaust, right? Even though we know it's real, it happened, but the same results were a people, a person, a race, a culture was being systematically genocided and killed off. And so I got into this running battle with somebody from the audience. He was a rabbinical student. And it ended up relaxing itself, but he kind of knew what I was trying to say. So we talked about this. We talked about the differences between the Holocaust, the difference between civil rights and the lynchings. And there is not that much. And the Jewish culture and the black culture had been divisive, had been separated, but it's coming back closer together because we have a lot of anti-Semitic issues that are going on around the country within the last 5 to 6 years. Synagogues being blown up, people being killed in churches, right? So there is still a similarity, there's a pattern. Yes? Okay, I'm going. So this.
I was trying to be quiet.
I know. You already told me before I started I didn't need a microphone either. So the last part of this is, I'm going to wrap this right up. So the last part, when we talk about that was then, this is now, and I bring this discussion up again. I bring it up Black History Month, and I bring it up Juneteenth. And we talk about where we are today in this country. So, as an African-American police officer, finishing up my last year on the job in the city of New Haven, and I just came back from the detective division and just said I don't want any more investigations. I'd rather be on the street. Big mistake, but I'm glad I did it. So I went back in uniform, and I went to meet a buddy after lineup and roll call. And he said, let's meet and let's have a conversation before we get out and start doing what we did do. The next thing I knew, we ended up meeting at Starbucks. So we go to Starbucks. I walk in, know the place like the back of my hand because that's my patrol area. Seen it, done it, seen everybody going through it. So I sat down, but then another detective from Yale came in and we're all sitting there. My partner, who was white, was engaged in a conversation with the detective, but meanwhile I had to go to the restroom. And now if you're in the heart of New Haven, Church and Chapel Street in New Haven, you know it's bustling down there. So I decided to go and ask the barrister for the key to the bathroom. The barrister looks at me, turns away, and I said, ma'am, can I use the bathroom? Because the key, you need a key to get in there. She walks away. So I said, you know what? I'm not going to fuss with this. I went next door to a computer store, which was open, used the bathroom. But when I came back, my partner looked at me and he said, Fletch, where'd you go? I said, I had to use the bathroom. He said, you know we can use this bathroom all day, any day, every day. And I said, I do know that. Why didn't you use it? I said, because the lady right there, the white barrister, said to me that the key was in a safe. Now, what Starbucks do you know in the middle of the morning hours, rush hour, is the door, the key gonna not open up the lock until 12 o'clock? So I sat down and he said, the white guy with the black suit on, the red tie, she just gave him the key. And I seen him give it back. And I said, really? So I went up and I asked, ma'am, how come you didn't give me the key? And she looked at me, walked away from me again. Then I said, because I'm in uniform, some cops, I thought I was a decent cop. I don't like to use my uniform as we say, code of blue or to intimidate. So I just said, okay, let me ask you again. Ma'am, how come I could not get the key? She said, I don't know, I found it. And so at that point, I realized what was actually happening covertly. I was being told that she didn't want me to use that bathroom for whatever reason. Not because she was busy, because it wasn't busy, it was only 2 people in there. She just decided she wanted to not let me use the bathroom. But it gets better, and I'm gonna, give me a minute. Because I know you got a cane somewhere. So when that happened, everything that went through my great-grandmother, remember I told you my 114-year-old great-grandmother? She talked about this. My grandparents, my mother's parents talked about this. My parents talked about this. So it was generational. So as I am reflecting on all of the conversations and hearing the voices from the past of my loved ones coming through my head, I was feeling about this big and hurt that this would be going on in the Northeast. Go to my car, sit down, made a complaint. Then I thought about it and we filed it. And then I said, you know what? I'll deal with God to have a way for me to tell this story. I didn't know I was going to be doing this or anything. But as I pulled that case off the dockets, and Starbucks didn't know I pulled it yet because they were getting ready to depose me. They hired a high-powered law firm from out of Hartford to defend this. So what I did was I said, you know what, I'm retiring. I'll deal with this somehow. The Lord will help me get through this. My attorney got this letter, which he copied me on it, and it said this: Dear Mr. Fletcher, although we know something happened, we are not in a position to say it occurred, but we know something happened. Kind of a lot of ambiguity in there, right? And I said, I don't know what this means. But for your troubles, we're going to give you $3,000 if you sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. In that non-disclosure agreement, the only way I could get that money, which I didn't take it, you all, was to sign off on that paperwork, and they would send me. That's what they valued, violating of my civil rights. But here's the ironic thing. I belong to one of the oldest HBCU fraternities in the world. And you know I'm going to say, I'm an Omega Psi Phi, I'm a Q. Right? So I'm a Q. But my 2 frat brothers, not separate chapters, different chapters, they were Qs too. So I started to feel a little some way about it because now Qs have been persecuted by Starbucks. And that sits in the back of my mind. So I have a documentary person coming out from Portland, Oregon on the 11th, and he's going to do a whole story about this, and he wants to take, he's a high-powered documentary person, he's going to take this back to Seattle and put it on Starbucks' doorstep, which I'm relieved to know. Chris, do I have 2 more minutes? Okay, 2 more minutes. And so, yeah, so that's what's going on. And, you know, I say this only because we have to look at the realities, the importance of where this ugly stuff comes from and where it sits. And it came from various places, but it's still here. And we got to do better. We have to do a lot better in order to make life better. The last story here is that I went undercover with the Ku Klux Klan, because you can't talk about civil rights, Juneteenth, or anything without talking about the Klan. Just like you can't talk about the Holocaust without Nazi Germany, Hitler being mentioned. So in 2013, I went undercover to the Ku Klux Klan because I belonged to a state police federal task force. And I know that I needed to tell the story of the Klan. And so what I did was I went online, because mind you, young folks in here, whatever you do on the computer, whether you're looking up bad things, bombs, gangs, terrorists, any of that, child pornography, we can see you. When you're in a task force, we can't see you. You can't see us. Our URL information is held in confidence. It's covert, but we can see you. When you go on there and you're on there for minutes, then you're supposed to be, it gets flagged. So what I did was I activated the Vigilante website, which allowed me to actually put out there in the ethers, I am looking for an original Ku Klux Klan hood and robe, if anyone has one out there. 2 weeks later, I get a hit. It happened to be an 88-year-old white minister from Boone, North Carolina. Showed me the pictures and everything. I told him I was a white youth minister trying to embolden, trying to keep the philosophy and the history of the Ku Klux Klan alive. And he bit it. For 6 months, he and I dealt back and forth online. Never talked to him on the phone, never seen me. Until the last 6 months, I asked him, I want to buy it. He felt comfortable enough, he said he'll sell it to me. But mind you, I had to hear about Trayvon Martin, I had to hear about Mr. Harris that was drugged from the back of a truck in Waco, Texas. I heard about everything humanly possible that affected black and brown people that were bad. And I had to contain my emotions because I've done this undercover stuff before, but I never did it online like this. So he sold it to me, but the grateful part about it was I was able to say to him after who I was, because I called him. And he didn't know what I was calling him for because he never knew I had a phone. And I let him know who I was. And at that point, he went off. But there's a sick relationship that the mob and Klan have with law enforcement, which is you don't cross that line. They don't cross that line. After that, probably my daughter and myself were in the living room, television room of my house. We were channel surfing, and I saw on Netflix this title, The Black Klansman. Saw that Black Klansman. So we started watching it. My daughter said, Dad, this is eerily similar to what you have done. And I said, really? So we started watching it, and then, because it came out in the newspapers and everything when I came from undercover and what I did. And at the same time, being a law enforcement officer, we got to do a timeline. So Spike Lee was in New Haven at Yale doing a teaching sabbatical at the time. And we surmised that Spike took that story and art imitates life, right? Or life imitates art, embellished a little bit, changed it a little bit, and made the movie The Black Klansman, which Denzel Washington's son allegedly plays me. We've been telling this story for 5 years, and the museum's attorneys, our museum's attorneys said keep telling it. If Spike Lee and his people have any problems with it, intellectual property or infringement, they would have sent a cease and desist letter. They know we're telling the story because it has been in the national newspapers. So he knows, but you won't see my name as a credit in there. So on this note, I just want to thank everybody. Chris is moving, you're moving, and I think you guys are going to come in on me. But I thank you all. If you don't have any questions,
You talked about history repeating itself.
Yes, sir.
And one of the things that is currently happening is there are books being banned from being read. The poet laureate, her book has been banned from being read in libraries. I guess it's Texas or Florida.
In Florida, infamous Florida. No offense to anybody who's from Florida, but it is Florida.
It's just interesting as to what is happening with us trying to teach Black history, okay, and how it is being repressed.
Okay. I got to answer this, Chris. Of course. What I'm getting ready to say, trust me. I say this with all honesty because I told you when I got up here, I speak truth to power. So as you say that, my good brother, right? As you say that, here we go. This museum has been open since 2021. I have to beg, plead, debate to get our Black and Hispanic caucus on our state legislative level to set foot into our museum. I have not been able to get any type of Black leadership organization into this museum. Now, perhaps because the town is run, the administration is run by a Republican mayor in her administration, which I think is asinine, excuse my language to young folk, which I think is very, very simple-minded, because by them showing up, are they believing that they show up, it'll show support for this mayor? And when you come to my museum, your politics don't matter to me, because that's gonna stay on the outside. We don't talk Republican, Independent, or Democrat in there. But that's the truism. And so, as I talked to the minority whip, Senator Kevin Kelly from Stratford, at the flag raising yesterday, one of the things that I said to him was just that, because he spent time in the museum filming it, and you can go to his legislative website and you'll see some of the museum where he posted it. But it's a sad commentary when I told him, so when they're looking to train, whether you're Black, white, you come from a HBCU, or you come from a traditional up here, UConn, Central, or Southern teaching institutions, when you start talking about looking for funding to train these people, to teach this AP curriculum, African American curriculum, how do you stand in the middle of that gallery at the state capitol and pound your fist and look at your colleagues on the other side and say, we need you to have bipartisanship support for this? How do you do that? I told him, when that conversation is put on the agenda, somebody please invite me up. Because my mama used to have one thing to say, I can tell you better than I can show you, right? Invite me up, and so when that conversation happens, I can look to this side, and I'll tell you, I'm a Democrat. I can look to this side, and I can look at my Democrat people and say, y'all need to go sit down. Y'all really need to sit down. And I say this very openly, very honestly, because that's what we speak, truth to power. And sometimes I'm brutally honest, which I can cut my nose, spite my face, but you know what? It is what it is, and if you want to come to the museum, you'll come. If you don't, that's okay. It's still going to go. I'm going to make this thing happen. And again, I thank you all very much for taking the time out of your morning. I thank Chris. I thank the action team for inviting me. I thank the library staff for having me here, and you all for taking time to come here this morning to hear my spiel, my stories, and what little bit I can give you. I hope I gave you some information. And we are a 501c3 non-profit organization, and I got to put that plug in there because we're on a big push for funding right now, and we can use every bit that you can give us. So I thank you again.